Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. All right. Hey guys, welcome back to True Drew Podcast. I actually just got back from Atlanta. My husband had a magic convention and I got to tag along and go to some of those events, but also I got to go thrifting with my parents. And if you know anything about me, some of my other obsessions, other than Nancy Drew, my Rabbit Reese, and coffee, thrifting is one of them. It's way up there. And if you've never gone thrifting in Atlanta, I highly recommend it. There's like 30 plus Goodwills and you can find so much cool stuff. But aside from just thrifting and finding cool stuff, I really just enjoy spending time with my parents. I don't know, I've just kind of been in a reflective mood lately. I don't know if it's just seeing the news of certain celebrities' passings and even friends of my family receiving really hard diagnoses for things. It just makes you really appreciate life, and I hope that you guys have family members and friends that are very important to you in your life that you can turn to when you're going through a hard time. And not to bring the episode down or anything, but I just want to say hold those people tight, hug them, love them, let them know how much you care, because as cliche as it sounds, we're not promised tomorrow. And although we cover mysteries on this podcast, I just think how we feel about people should never be left a mystery. I just felt like I needed to say that. Now, for the 150th episode today, which also I cannot believe that I have recorded 150 episodes of True Drew Podcast. Technically, actually more than that if you count True Drew Files, my subscription podcast, and then bonus Halloween episodes. That is crazy. But today we're going to be covering book number 108, The Secret of the Tibetan Treasure, which came out in 1992. So we're going to talk about this cover art first. There was only one book cover edition that I found for this title, but it has Nancy and George on the cover. And I was just saying on the last episode of the podcast when we covered The Legend of Miners Creek that I really enjoy the book covers where it's Nancy, Bess and George, or Nancy and George, or Nancy and Bess. Sometimes Ned. Ned has only been on a few of the covers. I was actually talking to somebody about this on Instagram, but I think The Invisible Intruder, The Double Jinx Mystery, I know for a fact he's on those two, but in these later paperbacks, I don't know. We'll have to see. But on this book cover, we have Nancy and George, and they're looking at this golden horse. This is the art piece that this mystery centers around, and there's a cabin on fire in the background behind them. But what I really want to highlight here is Nancy and George's outfits. I love them. They're both wearing sneakers, super casual. George is wearing black jeans and a pink button down, and Nancy's just wearing this white t-shirt and jeans, like the most American, very casual outfit that I could think of. Her hair is really blonde here, and then she's wearing a necklace, and this necklace is given to her in the book to borrow by this girl named Su Lin, who is from Tibet, or she's partially Tibetan. But I really like this cover. And there's actually a tagline too. It says, Nancy's on the trail of a hot artifact worth a cool $1,000,000 in cash. But yeah, I just kind of love when we get to see this more casual side of Nancy. Like in the earlier mystery stories, Nancy was a lot more polished, and that's kind of just the product of the time, the 1950s, 1960s, or even further back, the 1930s. But I bring this up because I had a funny interaction at an Atlanta bookstore this past weekend. I was checking out, I had some Nancy Drew books, and I sat them down on the counter, and the bookshop owner was like, Nancy Drew. And I just kind of waited for him to say something. And he said, yeah, these books, they were so popular. And I said, yeah, I still love them. I love to collect them. And I was like, I actually kind of nerd out and I have this podcast where I cover the books. But his commentary, it was very funny. He said, yeah, she kind of used to wear high heels, didn't she? And I was like, yeah, she's not known for having the most practical footwear when she's out doing her sleuthing. But later on, they updated her and he was like, oh yeah. And he was talking about the different cover editions and stuff, because I had found that cover edition of Clue of the Broken Locket where that guy is creepily kind of looking at Nancy, Bess and George in the boat. And so I was very excited to find that. But I thought that was very funny that his main takeaway was yeah, Nancy Drew, she used to wear heels when she chased bad guys, right? But yeah, I have to say I love this Nancy on the 90s covers. She feels a little more down to earth. But when it comes to giving this book cover a funny cover spoof, I just said, George, have you ever seen a gold-dipped My Little Pony? This My Little Pony looks expensive. Oh, did anyone else ever play with My Little Ponies growing up? Because they were some of my favorites. Or just horse figurines. I had so many of those. But when it comes to giving this book cover a rating, I would give it a 4.5 magnifying glasses. I love the colors in this cover, and I love that Nancy and George are together on this cover. Okay, so now really quickly I'll list the characters that we get to meet in The Secret of the Tibetan Treasure. So first up we have Nelson Stone. He is the museum curator. He's the one that hires Nancy at the beginning of this book. Amanda Lane, she was a donator of fine estates. She's passed away, but she's referenced several times in this book. Hilary Lane is her grandniece who has inherited a lot of her estate. Ralph Hayes, he's the security guard at the museum, which I think the museum is just called Clinton Park Museum. There's Lee Tung, he's the gardener at the museum, and his daughter, Sue Lin. There are some police officers, Lieutenant Higgins and Officer Jenkins in this book. Margaret Parker, who is the assistant curator at the museum. Dr. Morgan, who is a vet, Miss Ruby, who is a candy shop owner, Justin Todd, a jeweler, and his wife, Fiona, Miss Hopper, the custodian, Mr. Sharp, Professor Herbert, who is a Tibetan art expert. He has a couple of dogs named Brutus and Caesar, and I believe Hilary Lane has a couple of poodles named Marcus and Chloe. I always have to list the animals' names too, because they are characters as well. And now really quickly I'll read a synopsis for The Secret of the Tibetan Treasure. Danger rides a horse of gold into Nancy's hometown. When Nancy investigates the theft of a Tibetan antiquity from a local museum, she discovers that there's more to the mystery than a simple case of burglary. The golden horse is a very special kind of prize, and it attracts a very special kind of horse thief. A crook as daring as he is elusive, as cunning as he is ruthless. Duplicity, sabotage, and death threats are the tools of this criminal's trade. Drawn into a cleverly crafted web of lies and deceptions, Nancy finds that the trail to the truth is littered with poisoned clues and hidden traps. And she knows only one thing for sure: in the run for the gold, she runs the risk of taking a fatal fall. And now for a dramatically read newspaper headline synopsis. Nancy Drew solves museum mystery. Golden horses returned. And yes, you heard me correctly. Horses as in plural, so keep that in mind. Also, if you are familiar with the Nancy Drew computer game, The Secret of the Scarlet Hand, I think you're going to enjoy this book because it's very similar. It reminds me of The Secret of the Scarlet Hand in so many ways. We haven't actually covered that book yet, which is also called The Secret of the Scarlet Hand. It's the same title. It's coming up a little bit later in the series, but this will give you kind of a taste of that, I think. So, without further ado, let's jump into this book. So our book starts with Nancy answering the phone thinking it's Bess, but then a voice says, "This is the Pentagon calling Nancy Drew." And Nancy is like, "George, I know it's you." I thought this interaction was funny, but George compliments her and says someday the Pentagon may actually call Nancy and ask the world's greatest detective for help. Nancy says, "Yeah, and I'll hang up on them thinking it's you." But George is calling because she wants to play tennis with Nancy. Suddenly, though, the operator breaks in saying Nancy has a call and the man says it's an emergency, so she says she'll call George back. I'm glad they don't still do that. Total invasion of privacy. But it's a man named Nelson Stone, the curator at Clinton Park Museum. Nancy is aware of some legal issues because Carson told her about them. Amanda Lane, a wealthy socialite, donated her mansion to the museum. Like, that's where the museum is going to be, in this mansion. Kind of an odd setup. And Carson drafted the will. But now, Amanda Lane's grandniece, Hilary, has been contesting it. So Nancy asks if this is about that. Nelson Stone says it might have something to do with that, but he also thinks someone is trying to kill him, so Nancy agrees to meet him at the museum. So when they hang up, Nancy calls George back and invites her along, then she calls Bess because they had plans to meet at the mall, so Nancy goes to pick them both up. We do get an outfit description here. Nancy is wearing a t-shirt and jeans and a yellow linen blazer. So once Nancy has picked up Bess and George, Bess says Mr. Stone hasn't been in the area long, and George says she played him in tennis at the club and he has a wicked serve, but he's a bit stuffy. So they all get out at the Mansion Museum, which has a sign saying it's closed. Bess then sees a refreshment stand, and cue George being mean to her. She says she thought she was on a diet, and Bess is like, "It's a junk food diet. I'm getting ice cream." cream. Bye. I think we all need a little Bess energy in our lives. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm gonna go eat an ice cream sundae. Maybe you need a bag of chips because you're a little bit salty. So George decides to watch some guy make a mermaid out of a topiary bush because this mansion, it sounds really lavish. I mean, it's a mansion. So we've got this elaborate garden around it. So Nancy goes inside and she has to sign this guest book at the desk for Ralph Hayes, the security guy. She sees Hillary Lane has been by also. Her name is a few blocks above Nancy's. Nancy meets Nelson Stone after this, who is surprised that she's younger. I guess he hasn't seen all of the pictures that accompany all of the various newspaper articles about Nancy. But they walk through the museum and he tells her they recently bought a Tibetan artifact, the golden horse, for $1 million. Nelson shows the horse to Nancy and even lets her hold it before putting it back in the case and escorting her to his office. While they walk down the hall to his office, Nancy sees a red purse on a chair in another office they pass. So Nelson shows Nancy the threatening letter he received, but then he jumps up and is like, "Oh, I can't remember if I locked the case with the Tibetan horse." So he runs out of the room. Then when he comes back, he says the horse was stolen. Nelson is in shock, so Nancy guides him back to his office and goes to talk to the security guard. And he's asleep. Ugh. So Nancy goes back to Mr. Stone's office and she's going to call the police, but then he begs her not to because of the publicity and says this will ruin him. But Nancy tells him this is the fastest way to get the horse back. So Mr. Stone asks if she has to mention he left the case unlocked, and Nancy says yes, they have to tell the truth. So Nancy calls and the police say they'll be there soon. So Nancy goes outside of the museum to find Bess and George, and they're talking to the gardener, Lee Tung, and his daughter, Sue Lin. Everyone is concerned about the missing horse, and Nancy asks them if they saw anyone leaving the museum. Bess says they were watching the gardener shape a hedge, but then George says she remembers seeing a car leave, but she doesn't remember what it looks like. Meanwhile, this bus with kids for the museum tour leaves, and two officers, Lieutenant Higgins and Officer Jenkins, show up. They go wake up the security guard, who of course has no idea what's going on. So the officers look at the case the golden horse was in, then they go to question Mr. Stone. While they do that, Nancy looks around the museum. The back and side doors are shut off for building renovations, so the thief didn't leave that way. Nancy notes the only way out is the front door, which is odd and also against code in case of fire. So Nancy goes upstairs and she finds an open window and a fire escape. Nancy also finds a woman's gold earring on the floor near the window, so she puts it in her pocket as evidence. Also, remember, this is an old mansion that's being made into a museum, so it's laid out kind of odd and still has bedrooms. The book says it's 3 stories. So when Nancy goes back downstairs, she sees Sue Lin talking to the police. She says the horse being stolen is upsetting to her on another level because she is part Tibetan. Once the police move along, Nancy talks to Sue Lin, who says she has an internship at the museum through Westmore University's anthropology program. She says the assistant curator, Margaret Parker, is constantly asking her to do paperwork for her. Sue Lin says Margaret is off today, though. So Nancy walks off, and then she remembers the red purse she saw in the office next to Mr. Stone's. That was Margaret's office. So she goes back to Mr. Stone's office where he's still talking to Lieutenant Higgins when Officer Jenkins brings in Hillary Lane, saying he found her hiding in the library. Oh, things are about to get interesting. So Hillary Lane, a platinum blonde, the book says, is an ex-Hollywood actress, according to Nancy, who says she came back to River Heights a few years ago. But Hillary says she wasn't hiding in the library, she was doing research for a lecture she's giving on Oriental art. She does say she remembers hearing a scream, though, but she had just chalked it up to Nelson having a tirade against the staff again. Yikes. So Mr. Stone snaps how he runs the museum is none of her business. But after she leaves, Nancy tells the police she came to help Mr. Stone with a threatening letter he received. She's trying to just be very open and honest with them. She says the note is from someone saying they want to kill Mr. Stone because of how he's running the museum. So eventually the police leave and Nancy says she'll help find the golden horse. So when Nancy goes outside to find Bess and George and they're about to leave, they see Mr. Stone get in his Cadillac. But then the wheels spin out of control, he runs into some bushes, and then he slumps over the wheel. So Nancy and the girls run over to check on him, and he has a bruise on his forehead. And he says the brakes just failed. He was pushing the pedal and nothing was happening. So Nancy says she'll drive him home or to a doctor, and while Bess helps him over to Nancy's car, Nancy and George inspect the Cadillac. George gets in the driver's seat and pops the hood for Nancy. Nancy asks her to push the brakes, and when George does, brake fluid comes out, and Nancy can see a rupture in the hydraulic brake pipe. So she says it might have been tampered with, but she can't tell. Meanwhile, Lee Tung, the gardener, comes running up to them and helps them push the car back into the parking lot. When they take Mr. Stone home, he asks if they'll walk him inside because he's scared. So the girls get out, and Nelson sees a package in his mail, but he's reluctant to grab it, so Nancy does. Bess kindly says maybe it's a nice surprise this time. It turns out to be a box of gold flag chocolates. And Nancy jokes Bess can smell them from a mile away. Ugh. Bess, of course, has to make a comment that she's on a diet, but she says one chocolate won't hurt. And then George pokes her in the ribs, and Bess glares at her. Why any of this was necessary, I don't know. We just had to find another opportunity to put Bess down for her dietary choices. But there's no note with the chocolates. Mr. Stone puts them in a drawer. So Nancy checks the rest of the house, and she doesn't see anything suspicious, but she advises him to keep the door locked and maybe keep his window curtains drawn. So Nancy takes Bess and George home, then goes home herself. Hannah, the book says, makes the Drews a pot roast and fresh onion soup. Carson comments that Hannah's onion soup is one of his favorites, and Hannah actually sits down to eat with them. The book says the Drews considered her part of the family, and they always appreciated Hannah Gruen's loving attention. So Nancy talks to Carson about the case over dinner, and he says Hilary Lane expected to be made curator of the Mansion Museum when she came back from Hollywood. She actually has a degree in art history and is a big collector. And Hannah says Hilary Lane is actually hosting a dog show at her house this weekend, so Nancy thinks it may be just the excuse she's been looking for to investigate the heiress. Now, it's too bad Togo hasn't been mentioned since the earlier mystery stories because he would be the perfect cover. Nancy could take him and enter him into the dog show. I just want to know where Togo went. Why is he gone? He was so cute. He just kind of dropped off at some point in some of the paperback mysteries, and I didn't know that was going to be the last time we heard of him. Hopefully it's not the last time we've heard of him. But Nancy thinks maybe Hilary could have slipped past Mr. Stone's office and taken the golden horse. Maybe to embarrass him, or maybe to get the board to rethink his position as curator and hire her instead. So Nancy calls Mr. Stone after dinner to check on him, and he seems fine. He says his car is getting worked on. And next she calls Hilary Lane by getting her number from information. Nancy gets a housekeeper or someone who works for her and asks if she can come by and buy a ticket for the dog show since she knows Hilary and she's told that's okay. So Nancy decides to drive by Mr. Stone's house and everything looks fine. Then she goes to the car repair shop where his car is being worked on. On the way there, on the radio, a news station is talking about the stolen golden horse. So Nancy talks to the mechanic at the car repair shop, telling him her suspicions about the brake pipe being cut, so they go look at it. He says it looks like a hacksaw was taken to it, and his flashlight flickers off, so Nancy checks the glove compartment to get another one, and she gets the fright of her life. A woman is laying across the front seat, her head dangling towards the floor of the car. It turns out to just be Margaret Parker, the assistant curator, and the mechanic is shocked she's still there and asks if she found her missing earring. Margaret says no and mentions she helped Mr. Stone with some books that morning and thought maybe her earring could have fallen out in his car. But Nancy wonders if the earring she's missing is the one she found in the museum. So Margaret starts to leave, but Nancy catches her to ask her some questions. Nancy introduces herself first and mentions she was at the museum when the golden horse was stolen. So she asks Margaret if she was at the museum that day, and she says no, she was off. Nancy brings up the fact that she helped Mr. Stone with some books, and she snaps that he dropped them off at her house, and she doesn't appreciate being put through the 3rd degree before leaving. A little bit touchy about that subject of being at the museum the day that the horse was stolen, aren't we? So Nancy heads home, and the next day she meets Bess and George at a restaurant called, wait for it, Pancake City, like from Alibi and Ashes. I thought this was so cute. The fact that Her Interactive pays attention to so many of these details from the books and puts them in the games, I thought that was so amazing. But they eat breakfast at Pancake City and chat, and Nancy talks about Hilary Lane and Margaret Parker both being suspects. Nancy drives George to the country club since she ran to the restaurant. Her car was having problems, and Nancy says she'll come back to pick her up in a little while. George asks her to get her and Bess tickets to the dog dog show also so they can go with her. So after this, Nancy drives to Hillary Lane's house and a butler opens the door and gives her the dog show ticket. But Nancy says she wants to thank Hillary in person and also get 2 more tickets. So the butler lets her in and Nancy is greeted by Hillary and her 2 poodles, Marcus and Chloe. Nancy talks to Hillary for a minute and she says it's too bad Mr. Stone was so careless and left the case for the golden horse unlocked. Hillary, it seems, is really enjoying this publicity, this bad publicity for the museum. She also makes the comment that the Lane Mansion is the only house she's ever loved where the museum is housed, and Mr. Stone doesn't consider her opinions on the renovations. That would be really weird, to have this house that you kind of grew up in be willed off to be a museum, and you have no say in what happens to it. I guess that's how wills work. But Nancy and Hillary talk some more, and she shows Nancy a book she helped do the foreword on about Oriental art. She says she has dolls like the ones pictured in the book, and Nancy asks to look at them. So Hillary takes Nancy up to see them, and Nancy sees the dolls, but also the golden horse in one of the glass cases. So Nancy states the obvious, and she says, "It's the golden horse!" And Hillary is like, "Yeah, isn't it great?" Nancy is trying to figure out her next move, should I call the cops? What's going on? Is she going to confess? When Hillary goes on and explains that it's one from a pair. They were smuggled out of Tibet in the 1950s when China invaded, and Hillary bought one of them a few years ago. She really wanted the second one, but Nelson Stone outbid her on behalf of the museum. So that's another touchy subject. Hillary didn't get to keep this mansion, and she was outbid on this piece of art. So on the way back down to get the dog show tickets, Hillary makes the comment she would ask Nancy to stay for lunch, but the cook is off. She must be incapable of fending for herself. While they're down there in the foyer, though, Hillary offers Nancy a gold flag chocolate, the same kind of chocolates Mr. Stone received in the mail. But when Hillary comes back with the change from the dog show tickets, she's carrying a red purse like the one Nancy saw in Margaret Parker's office the day of the robbery. So Hillary is looking really, really suspicious right now. But Nancy meets George back at the country club and they have lunch, and Nancy is saying she wants to investigate to see if there really are 2 golden horses because Hillary could have just been lying. George also mentions her tennis game was lousy, and then she talks about watching a tennis tournament later that night on TV and says Bess will be so mad because the show she normally watches and likes, Wheel of Chance, won't be on. This is definitely a takeoff of Wheel of Fortune. So later, Nancy calls Mr. Stone's office and she gets Margaret. She says he's not in and Nancy can leave a message, but that's the last thing she wants to do. So Nancy next decides to call Sue Lynn, and when she picks up, she's upset. She says her father lost his job at the museum. Nancy asks if she can come by and gets their address. So Lee tells Nancy that Mr. Stone fired him over a missing gardening tool, and he says he has a temper. He says it was a hacksaw and it was found near the parking lot. So Nancy has to wonder, was that what someone used to cut Mr. Stone's brake pipe? So Nancy tells Mr. Tongue she would like to get a look at the hacksaw because she thinks maybe she can persuade Mr. Stone to hire him back. It's probably just all a misunderstanding. She doesn't say this part out loud, but she wants to see if there are traces of oil on the hacksaw that might confirm it was used to cut Mr. Stone's brake pipe. So Mr. Tongue gives her the keys to the tool shed at the museum. So Nancy leaves their apartment with the key and she goes to the museum and it's dark. Now, this is crazy, but Nancy takes some wire cutters and she just cuts a hole in the fence to sneak in. Wild. Never thought I'd see the day when Nancy destroyed property like that. But she sneaks through the hole in the fence and sneaks over to the tool shed. She unlocks it and she looks around and she finds the hacksaw. As she shines her light on it, sure enough, she sees traces of oil and some metal filings. So this was most likely used on Mr. Stone's brake pipe. So Nancy grabs a cloth so she can pick up the saw by the handle and not mess up any prints. And as she goes out of the shed, someone snatches the hacksaw from her and shoves her back into the tool shed, locking her in. Nancy is able to escape out of a window in the shed, but it's a 6-foot drop. She has to grab the gutter on the outside of the shed, but it comes off and she falls to the ground, hurting her ankle. So Nancy limps back to her car and then she hears footsteps, but it's just Mr. Tongue. He says he realized he shouldn't have let Nancy come by herself, but she tells him what happened and he insists on taking her back to Sue Lynn so she can make her some tea and an herbal compress for her ankle. So we figured out that the hacksaw was what was most likely used on the brake pipe, but now we don't have the evidence. Now on the way back to Mr. Tongue's apartment, he talks about how much better his job was when he worked for Amanda Lane instead of Mr. Stone. He also makes the comment there were many parties and Hillary Lane was like a princess and the mansion was her castle. Now back at the apartment, Sue Lynn takes care of Nancy and says she's sorry Nancy got hurt and it's all their fault. But Nancy says it's okay and it's not their fault. She tells Sue Lynn she's actually a bit of a detective, and Sue Lynn says it would be great if Nancy could find the golden horse. Nancy asks if there are actually 2 golden horses, and Sue Lynn says there are. She says her professor, Professor Herbert, has written a book on Tibetan art, and Nancy may like to talk to him. But after a few minutes, Mr. Tongue says goodbye to Nancy, and Sue Lynn drives her home since they left Nancy's car at the museum. Which, that's not great. The next day, the security guy is going to see Nancy's car, the hole in the fence, the broken gutter on the tool shed, and put it all together. Unless he's sleeping on the job again. But as Sue Lynn drops Nancy off at home, Nancy asks her if she can find out if Margaret Parker has a red purse. Sue Lynn says she was going to quit at the museum since her father was fired, but Nancy convinces her to stay on. Sue Lynn also gives Nancy a jade and silver necklace with a locket on it that she says was given to her great-grandmother by her husband as a wedding gift. She wants Nancy to wear it because there's a legend in her family that no one can harm the person who wears it. Nancy's hesitant to wear it because it's an heirloom and it's very valuable, but Sue Lynn insists, but makes Nancy promise to never open the locket. So the next morning, Nancy takes a taxi to go get her car at the museum, and when she gets back home, Mr. Stone calls her. He says he's shook up because his neighbor's spaniel is ill, and when Nancy says she's sorry, Mr. Stone snaps, "I don't care about the animal, it's me I'm worried about." Wow, what a jerk. So Nancy asks what happened, and Mr. Stone says the dog, Rusty, got into his trash and ate all the gold flag chocolates he threw out. He didn't feel safe eating them because he thought they might be poisoned. So Nancy is quick to tell him that chocolates will make any dog sick, especially that many. But Mr. Stone insists that the vet, Dr. Morgan, pumped Rusty's stomach, which, I mean, he should have. That still doesn't prove that the chocolates were poisoned, but Nancy says she'll look into it. I'm starting to see why people don't like this guy. But Nancy next asks where Mr. Stone was last night because she still doesn't know who locked her in the shed, and he says he was watching Wheel of Chance like he does every Thursday night. So Nancy and Mr. Stone hang up, and she makes some notes in her notebook. She writes down, Mr. Stone, 1. Receives threatening letter. 2. Brake pipe cut with hacksaw, brakes fail. 3. Looks for hacksaw in tool shed, gardener fired. 4. ND locked inside tool shed, hacksaw stolen. 5. Dog poisoned after eating chocolate sent to Stone. And 6. Curator watches Wheel of Chance regularly. That's when Nancy remembers something, and she goes to grab the newspaper to check the TV listings. Oh, remember when you could do that? And she sees that Wheel of Chance was canceled because of the tennis tournament the other night. So Nelson Stone deliberately lied to her. Why? Could he be the one who pushed Nancy into the tool shed? So Nancy next calls Dr. Morgan, the vet, to ask about Rusty the Spaniel, and all the vet can really say is he ate almost the whole box of chocolates, and he was naturally very sick from that. But he could have also gotten sick from anything in Mr. Stone's trash. So there's really no definitive answer on whether those chocolates were poisoned or not. So the book next says Nancy wants to find out who sent Mr. Stone the chocolates, and she needs an expert in chocolates. So she calls Bess. You know what then? Call me a chocolate expert too then. I think my favorites are those strawberry or orange ones from the assortments. Don't put me down for any of those Death Threat Rick Arlen chocolates though. So Bess tells Nancy there are only 2 shops in River Heights that carry the Gold Flag chocolate brand. So they go in one called the Candy Boutique, and Nancy asks to speak to the manager, and she's told they're off. So she explains that a friend of hers got some chocolates but lost the card with the name of the sender on it, and he wants to thank that person. The woman working there says they don't keep records like that on file, but she says Hillary Lane is a top customer when Nancy asks. So next, Nancy and Bess go to this place called Ruby's Chocolate Shop, and Bess says she's doomed because she loves their fudge. She buys some, and then she asks Miss Ruby if she ships out gifts, and she says she does. So Bess asks if Mr. Stone has received anything lately, and Ruby says she can check. She looks, and she sees where she sent a box to Mr. Stone on Friday, but doesn't know who it's from. So Nancy asks if she can look at orders with credit card receipts, and Ruby pulls them. So according to Ruby, one of the purchases made on Thursday was by Nelson Stone himself. So Nancy asks for a description of the man who paid for the order, and sure enough, the description fits Mr. Stone. Now the question is, why would he send himself chocolates and then claim they were poisoned? Nancy is beginning to wonder if everything else has been staged too, including the threatening note and the cut brake pipe. Why does Mr. Stone want people to think his life is being threatened, and why did he hire Nancy in the first place? So Nancy and Bess next go to the Clinton Park Police, and she talks to Lieutenant Higgins. He says he spoke to Chief McGinnis, and Nancy comes highly recommended. I think at first, when Nancy was at the museum, he kind of had some reservations, so he checked into her. So Nancy talks to him about the threatening letter to Mr. Stone, and the lieutenant says they've ruled out the possibility of a connection between it and the robbery. Nancy says they should keep that door open, though, and asks if she can get a copy of the letter. So she takes the letter back out to Bess, and they look at it in the car. The note says, "To Nelson Stone, this letter is not a joke, but is written by someone who will take pleasure in destroying you. The way you run the museum and treat your staff is disgusting. You are a bully and a snob. We don't need you in Clinton Park. Get out of town if you value your life." So Nancy takes a closer look at the letter, and she sees the T's in the letter have a break, and she's almost positive Mr. Stone wrote the letter to himself. Now all she has to do is find the typewriter the note was made on. So Nancy tells Bess she wants to catch Mr. Stone off guard at the dog show. So the next day, Nancy, Bess, and George go to the dog show at Hillary Lane's mansion. There's a big turnout. George says she hopes she's wearing the right thing, and Bess looks at her denim miniskirt and says, maybe for a rodeo. Then Bess says she hopes she doesn't look too overdressed in her wide brim hat and flower print dress, and George says, you look just like Little Bo Peep. I love that they're trash talking each other. But Nancy is wearing a green knit dress according to the book. Also, I haven't said anything about it up to this point, but Ned does not appear in this book. I don't know when he will reappear next. We'll have to check on that. But anyways, Nancy spots Margaret Parker across the crowd and says she's going to go see if she's carrying a red purse. So she walks up to talk to Margaret and asks if she remembers her from the car repair shop, and Margaret is very unenthusiastic. She's like, yeah. She tries to walk off, and Nancy walks alongside her, asking if she ever found her earring, and she says no. Margaret excuses herself, and then Nancy notices with disappointment that she's carrying a white purse, not a red one. But Sue Lynn comes up to talk to Nancy. She's at the dog show, and she has a couple of German shepherds in tow. They growl a little bit, and Nancy jokes, will your family's necklace protect me against wild beasts? And Sue Lynn pulls them back on their leashes. She says they belong to Professor Herbert, her anthropology teacher. Nancy sees the professor standing and talking to Margaret Parker across the way, and Sue Lynn says she can introduce Nancy to the professor after she takes the dogs over to the arena for the show. So after she walks off, Mr. Stone comes up, and he nervously says the police haven't gotten anywhere with finding the golden horse. He also says he thinks they aren't taking his death threat seriously. Nancy starts to say she needs to talk about some things with him, but then a woman comes up and comments on Sue Lynn's locket that Nancy is wearing, saying it's so beautiful. Mr. Stone starts looking at it too, and saying a clerk at the museum has one just like it, and it's Tibetan and very valuable. Nancy's feeling really uncomfortable with them both looking at her and the locket, but it turns out the woman's name is Fiona, and she calls to her husband, Justin Todd, who she says is a jeweler. Mr. Stone takes that opportunity to say he needs to go talk to the museum society trustees. Very convenient. But he whispers to Nancy as he leaves, if it weren't for museum politics, I wouldn't have shown up today. I really dislike crowds. So Fiona is there, and Nancy's stuck talking to her, and she tells Justin she wants him to make a copy of the necklace, and he says, I don't do copies. Fiona starts to object, but then Professor Herbert jumps in that she's embarrassing Nancy. He introduces them all, and the professor makes the connection that Nancy is Carson Drew's daughter. Fiona then makes the comment that she bets Carson made a bundle handling Amanda Lane's estate, and then embarrassed her husband carts her off. So then Nancy and Professor Herbert are left there talking to each other. Professor Herbert says Nancy is a famous teenage detective he's heard a lot about, and Nancy humbly says she's solved a few mysteries here and there. But then Professor Herbert goes on to say that he heard Nancy was at the museum the day of the robbery, and she says she was. She also tells him she knows one of his students, Sue Lynn, and Professor Herbert asks if she gave Nancy the necklace, and she says she loaned it to her. So he thoughtfully lights up a tobacco pipe and says Sue Lynn told him she never opens the locket. And then Nancy changes the subject and asks about the book on Tibetan art that he wrote. And she says she's become very interested in it since meeting Sue Lynn and since the golden horse was stolen. So Professor Herbert says he feels bad about it being stolen because he was actually the one who encouraged the museum to buy the horse, and he's the one who authenticated it. So Nancy asks if Professor Herbert thinks the museum overpaid for the golden horse, and he asks why she would say that. And Nancy just shrugs and says something Hillary Lane said the other day. So the professor says between him and her, he wouldn't be surprised if Hillary stole the horse because she was mad Mr. Stone outbid her. Nancy says maybe she wanted the pair of horses reunited, and the professor says as a pair, they would be double the value. That is a pretty strong motive for stealing it. So anyways, George runs up about this time saying she can't find Bess and it isn't like her to disappear. So Professor Herbert says goodbye to them and tells Nancy to come see him sometime. Now next, Hilary Lane walks up and she talks about how the turnout has been so good and the judging is about to start for Best in Breed and then Best in Show. An usher comes up to tell her that one of the dog trainers is sick, but it's okay. One of the girls from the audience has volunteered to show the sheepdog, Oliver, around the ring. I think you know where this is going. So Hilary then escorts Nancy and George to some nice seats and she says, "I can't let Carson Drew's daughter sit in the back row." Then she walks off with a wink. Nancy realizes they're right behind the Todds and they're whispering about the necklace Nancy is wearing. Justin tells his wife angrily that she shouldn't have mentioned in public that he does copies of jewelry. And Fiona says maybe if he did more copies, he'd make more money. And Justin snaps that his shop, the gold mine, has been doing great. And he's only done one reproduction for Charles Herbert. So Fiona points out the professor still owes them money, and Justin defends him, saying he's had financial problems lately. Now at that moment, George spots Bess, and she's leading the sheepdog Oliver into the ring, and Nancy says she can't believe it. So hearing Nancy's voice, Justin Todd turns around startled, and he sees Nancy, but she just ignores him. Nancy and George meanwhile laugh at Bess with the sheepdog, but she actually leads him to win Best in Breed. I think the book says she cited her dog walking abilities, like she walks her neighbor's Scotty dog sometimes, so she was like, oh yeah, I can walk this sheepdog around the ring, it's a piece of cake. You know, speaking as someone who occasionally pet sits still, sometimes it depends on the sheepdog though. But at intermission, the girls go to find Bess and they see Mr. Stone and Professor Herbert arguing. But before Nancy can hear what they're arguing about, Oliver the sheepdog pulls Bess over to a garbage can and he tips it all over himself. Case in point. So they try to clean him off, but he's a mess. Oliver ends up shaking off on Bess and then running out in the middle of the arena. So all the other dogs go crazy and it's pure chaos. So the girls leave a little bit later and George says, well, Hilary Lane got what she wanted. She got a memorable dog show. They actually see her coming across the parking lot and she looks at them and then just walks in the other direction. But as Nancy approaches her car, she sees a window has been smashed in on it. And in the driver's seat, there's a note written in red, pinned down with a knife. It says, mind your own business, Nancy Drew. Oh, Nancy got a threatening note. We know it's serious now. So Nancy carefully gets the knife and note without touching them with her bare hands, and she takes them by the River Heights police station so they can run them for prints. So the next day, Nancy goes to see Mr. Stone because she really wants to talk to him about a few things. She asks him point blank where he was on Thursday night, and he repeats the same lie he told her initially, that he was watching Wheel of Chance. But Nancy calls his bluff and he gets mad and he says he doesn't need someone to give him the TV listings. Then he says he doesn't need her help anymore actually anyways. So Nancy sees herself out and walks back through the museum. While she's leaving, she sees a man pinning up a bulletin notice and he drops it. So when she picks it up, she notices that Mr. Stone is the one who wrote it. And the T's break in this note as well. So she has confirmation now that he wrote the threatening note to himself. So Nancy leaves the museum to go meet Bess and George at a store at the mall called Glad Rags, where Bess is looking for a dress to wear to another one of her cousin's weddings. This next part makes me want to punch George, but Nancy asks how dress hunting is going and George says, not great. Bess is looking for a dress that makes her look 2 sizes smaller. R.I.P. George Fane. Who says that to another woman? She says it within earshot because Bess is in the dressing room. So rude. Bess, however, does find a beautiful pink silk dress, and it sounds like George wasn't invited to the wedding anyways, so suck on that, George. But after Bess makes her purchase, Nancy says she wants to go grab lunch at some place called Black Swan. Yet another restaurant in River Heights with a strange name. What's on that menu? Paranoia and hallucinations? But Bess makes a face and she says they have dried up sandwiches. But Nancy says she really wants to go there so she can stake out the jewelry shop that's across from it. So they sit there and they have a little lunch, and as soon as they see Justin leave, they pay their check and go over to his jewelry store, Goldmine. As they enter, Nancy hides Sue Lynn's necklace under her shirt and she whispers to Bess and George to pretend they're very interested in jewelry making because she wants to try and see the workshop. So they go in and they look around, and George says she's taking a jewelry making class and is really interested in the process. Bess also begs the guy working to see the workshop, and then they're let in. He shows them some molds they use in the jewelry making process, and when he has to leave to help a customer, Nancy climbs up a ladder and looks at the molds closer. While she's up there though, the guy suddenly comes back and Nancy knocks the ladder out from under herself and has to grab onto the shelf. All the molds fall and the shelf breaks, but Nancy finds what she was looking for, a horse-shaped mold. They get kicked out of the store, and on the drive as they leave, Nancy tells them she's really suspecting Professor Herbert now. She says there's nothing wrong with owning a copy of an art piece, but why would Justin Todd be so secretive about the fact that he makes copies? So she drops Bess off for a dentist appointment, and then Nancy suggests that she and George go talk to the professor. Nancy finds his office after talking to Sue Lynn for a few minutes at the university, and his secretary has her wait because he's on the phone. Nancy overhears Professor Herbert talking to a Mr. Sharp on an agreed price for something that is very rare. So when Nancy finally gets to go in and talk to him, the professor chuckles and asks how River Heights' famous teenage detective is doing, and Nancy can tell he doesn't take her very seriously. So Nancy plays that up and she says she hasn't had any cases and may want to take some anthropology classes. So Professor Herbert says it's a fascinating subject and then starts talking about Sue Lynn's necklace, which Nancy is still wearing, and says it's a Tibetan custom for grooms to give their bride a piece like that, and a lot of times they have jewels hidden inside. So he asks Nancy if she has ever peeked, and she says no. Then all of a sudden Professor Herbert's secretary barges in saying, "Here are the notes on the golden horse." I mean, she basically just handed this guy as a suspect over to Nancy on a silver platter. But Nancy kind of plays it off and says she has to go, but as she leaves, she grabs the typewriter ribbon from the secretary's typewriter. She's going to replace the ribbon, but then she hears footsteps, so she just has to run. She and George speed off, and Nancy says she's going to decipher the ribbon later, but then she notices a tan car that's been following them since they left the university. It's overtaken by a black van, which starts to try and push them into a ravine. I mean, you really know when you're getting somewhere in a mystery when someone tries to push your car off the road. Their car does end up going over the ravine, but Nancy and George are thankfully both okay. A police officer comes along at just the right time too and helps them, but they all comment on how lucky they are they weren't seriously hurt. The police officer points up the hill and says they have the lady with the car phone to thank. So Nancy looks up there and she sees Margaret Parker. Nancy calls up to her because she wants to talk to her, but then she leaves. Now, unfortunately, the black van's license plate wasn't captured, but Nancy has to wonder why Margaret was following them. George also says she's almost certain the car that drove away from the museum the day of the robbery was a tan one. So Nancy gets Margaret's address from the police statement and says they're going to pay her a visit. They have some questions to ask her. So they show up at her house and knock on the door, and no one answers. So Nancy changes tactics and says she knows Margaret is scared, but there will be no hiding from this. Margaret finally flings the door open. Nancy got a reaction with that, and she says she is not afraid of anything. She says she saw Nancy's car go into the ravine and she called the police. That's it. But Nancy asks if she also told the police that she was following them, and she gets really pale and denies following them. And Nancy is like, right, just like you weren't at the museum the day of the robbery. Margaret also denies this, and George says she saw her car there and she'd be willing to testify to it. And Nancy also shows her the earring, the nail in the coffin. She found the earring, she says, and Margaret tries to snatch it from her. Nancy repeats that they should talk, and Margaret sighs and leads them to her living room. As they go into the living room, Nancy also spots a red purse on a table along the way. Now, once in the living room, Nancy says she can prove she stole the golden horse, cut Mr. Stone's brake pipe, and sent him poisoned chocolates. And Margaret splutters that she's got it all wrong. She goes on to explain that Mr. Stone told her her job depended on it, and he'd help her in her career if she did him a favor. So apparently, they bought the golden horse, but another expert took a look at it and proclaimed it was a fake. But Margaret says it was an art dealer connection of Professor Herbert's, and that person skipped town. So when Nancy asks why they didn't just go back to Herbert, Margaret says the press would have been horrible and people would have lost faith in the museum. So they devised a plan where she would steal the fake horse and they could still collect on the insurance policy. Mr. Stone wanted Nancy in his office at the time that Margaret stole the fake horse because it served as the perfect alibi. Margaret also admits that Mr. Stone got carried away trying to make the attempts on his life look real, and he poisoned the dog, cut his own brake pipe, and shoved Nancy into the tool shed and put the note in Nancy's car when he realized she was getting too close to the truth. The dog, though. That's so horrible. Why would you do that? But Nancy says they have to tell the police, so they call and Lieutenant Higgins and Officer Jenkins show up. Higgins says the case is closed, but Nancy explains this is the copy of the golden horse. They still haven't found the real one. So Nancy and George leave, and Nancy says maybe the professor switched the horses and he has the real one. So as they're pulling away from the house, they actually see Mr. Stone coming by in his car. He must be going to see Margaret, but when he sees the cop car near her house, he roars past so he can turn around in the street. So Nancy pulls her car across the road, blocking him. He gets out and yells at her to move, but Nancy just locks her doors and lays on the horn until the police come out. So Mr. Stone and Margaret Parker are arrested on charges of conspiracy and insurance fraud, but Nancy says the case is far from over. What's crazy to me is that they were trying to avoid bad publicity, and look what happened. They got even worse publicity. So Nancy and George go back to her house and they decipher the typewriter ribbon, and the gist of it is that Professor Herbert is trying to sell the actual golden horse to Mr. Sharp. So Nancy says without the physical letter as evidence, though, the police will never believe them. She wants to break into the professor's office that night to get the actual copy of the letter. So George says she's in, and they get Nancy's lock-picking kit and they dress all in black. Dang, first the case of the artful crime a few books ago, now this book. Nancy is getting good at being a cat burglar. So Nancy and George go to the university campus late that night and they go through a service entrance. Nancy picks the lock to Herbert's office, but then George panics when she hears an elevator coming up. Luckily, it keeps going and stops a few floors above them. So they look through the file cabinets in the office under S for Sharp, but they don't find anything. Then they hear something in Herbert's outer office. So George jumps behind the couch, but Nancy doesn't have time to, so she stands casually by the desk and slips off her ski mask and gloves so she looks like she's not an intruder. Which I'm like, you're standing there in the dark. But then when a lady with a vacuum comes in, Nancy is like, oh, hi. All the lady does is says Nancy will hurt her eyes trying to read in that kind of light, and Professor Herbert shouldn't make her work so late. So she assumes Nancy is his secretary. Nancy quickly says her name is Bess, and she hopes George doesn't laugh behind the couch. The woman, named Miss Hopper, is a custodian. So Miss Hopper also helps Nancy when she says she forgot to make a copy of some important papers, but she's afraid the professor locked the top drawer of his desk. So Miss Hopper leans over, pulls out a spare key taped under the desk, and unlocks the drawer. She says she was pretty sure there was a key under there somewhere. But then she starts to clean around the couch, and afraid that she'll find George, Nancy asks if she can come back later so she can focus. So Miss Hopper leaves, and George comes out from behind the couch. Nancy is able to find the letter from Herbert to Sharp, trying to sell the golden horse for $500,000. But then they hear a growl in the outer office. It's two German shepherds, Brutus and Caesar, Professor Herbert's dogs. So Nancy grabs a chair and George gets a lamp to fend them off, because they're being really aggressive. And in walks Professor Herbert. He says, well, if it isn't our nosy little detective and her friend, I thought I'd seen the last of you two when I forced your car off the road. So he was the one in the black van. Nancy tells him she knows he stole and switched the real golden horse and the police will be there soon. But Professor Herbert says it's not like he left the horse in the office. Then he mocks them and says he's going to make sure they keep their cute noses out of his business once and for all. Ugh. So he leads them out to the van with their hands tied, puts them in the back with the dogs, and says they won't hurt them if they don't move. So Professor Herbert drives for a while until they get to a cabin out in the middle of nowhere. You know, the preferred places of villains everywhere. Nancy tells him kidnapping is a serious offense, and anyway, Mr. Stone and Margaret Parker have been arrested already. It's all going to lead back to him. But Professor Herbert says they can't prove anything, and George says they know Todd copied the horse for him. Professor Herbert is shocked that they know all that and says he'll shut Justin up too. And Nancy says he'll have to shut Fiona up also. This is getting to be a lot of people, you know? Are you gonna get rid of everybody? Justin, Fiona, Nancy and George? But angrily, the professor pushes them into the cabin. While he's lighting a kerosene lamp, Nancy sees her chance. She kicks the table it's on, and the lamp falls to the floor, starting a fire. The dogs run outside, scared. So Nancy kicks at Professor Herbert, but he jumps aside and hits her across the face. He then stands over Nancy and George and says he'll just let them burn to death, and it will be a tragic accident. This guy is evil. Before he leaves, though, Herbert snatches Sue Lynn's locket off Nancy's neck, and he opens it out of curiosity. Red powder puffs into the air and he screams that his eyes are burning. So Nancy grabs the locket and she and George get out and cut the ropes off their hands. But Nancy says they can't leave Herbert behind. They drag him out of the burning cabin as the roof collapses. Nancy whispers to George she thinks cayenne pepper was in Sue Lynn's locket. So Herbert begs for water for his eyes, but Nancy demands to know where the golden horse is first. Professor Herbert says it's buried under a boulder near the cabin. So this is the scene from the book cover. Herbert also says he has water in his van. Nancy can't get to the van because of the dogs, though. She has to grab a piece of wood that's on fire and wave them back with it. So they tie Herbert up and give him some water, then they start digging. They find the golden horse buried in a cloth sack. So they take the professor to the police, and Nancy shows the officers the golden horse and the letter from Herbert to Sharp. Nancy gets pulled into a sting operation to catch Sharp since Herbert is uncooperative. Nancy is wired and mic'd up, and a fake letter is sent to Sharp saying Herbert is afraid he's being watched and he wants to pass the horse off via one of his students. So Nancy waits in the designated spot, being watched by police with the fake horse in her bag. A black jaguar roars up and a man in a disguise gets out, and it's Justin Todd. So Todd and Sharp are one and the same. He shoves Nancy into the car and takes off, holding her at gunpoint. Also, did you notice something? Justin Todd, another guy in the Nancy Drew universe with 2 first names. They can't be trusted. So Todd demands to know why Carson Drew's daughter is making an exchange, and he accuses her of working for the cops when they hear a siren behind them. But Nancy points out, you did just run a red light, so it's probably just a traffic cop. He buys that for the moment. But then Todd says he's going to have Nancy call the professor to make sure she's on the level, and he only gets the secretary. So Nancy says he's supposed to meet her later, and all she wanted was a better grade. She's kind of like, this is dragging out. Like, all I wanted was an A in this class. Can we get this show on the road? So Todd tells her to put the horse in the back seat and take the briefcase, which has $500,000 in it. And then this part's crazy, but Nancy convinces Sharp/Todd to drop her back off at the park where they started. And he does. So the police catch him and they say Nancy should work again with them sometime. Now at the end of this mystery, Nancy gets a Medal of Honor from the Clinton Park Police. Mr. Stone, Margaret Parker, Professor Herbert, and Justin Todd all face charges, and Hillary Lane is made the new museum curator. And the golden horses are reunited at last. Nancy also thanks Sue Lynn for letting her borrow her necklace, but there's no word on whether Lee Tung, her father, gets his job back, but I hope that he did. So now let's go on to a little segment that I like to call What's Cookin'. So in this book, we had mentionings of pot roast, salad, bread, coffee and tea, milkshakes, Hannah Gruen's fresh onion soup, blueberry pancakes, banana pancakes, toasted English muffins, soda, hamburger and fries, grilled cheese, ginseng tea, and fudge. Now let's go on to the things that I think Nancy could add to her resume. So trespassing with wire cutters is one of them, because I did not expect Nancy to destroy the museum's property like that. Like, she just cut a hole in the fence. I mean, all for the sake of solving a mystery, but still. Also, dog tamer. Her and George kind of had to use some furniture to fend off those German shepherds. And sting operation accomplice. She worked with the police like she was wired and mic'd the whole bit. And honestly, Bess could add something to her resume. She could say that she showed a dog in a professional dog show, which would look pretty cool on a resume. So now let's talk about the things I liked and didn't like about The Secret of the Tibetan Treasure. Now, I loved the museum setting because, again, it really reminded me of the Nancy Drew computer game, The Secret of the Scarlet Hand. I thought the villain was great, and there were a lot of twists and turns. Like, there were technically a lot of people guilty of something in this book. But the things I didn't like poisoning the dog. They honestly should have gotten Mr. Stone on counts of animal cruelty, if you ask me. But when it comes to giving this book a rating, I would still give it 5 magnifying glasses. I thought this was a really, really good one. It kept me guessing. So that concludes this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. For next week's episode of the podcast, we're going to jump into the next Nancy Drew book, number 109, The Mystery of the Masked Rider. So if you like mysteries that primarily take place at horse shows and Halloween masquerades and truly unhinged villains, you're definitely going to like this one. Until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.